Victor Bricks stood in the doorway of an empty bedroom, staring at a bed that hadn't been slept in. The coffee on the nightstand was still half full, gone cold hours ago. His hands were shaking, though he didn't notice it yet. Somewhere down the hall, his 5-year-old son was holding a stuffed bear so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Vivian was gone. Not missing. Not taken. Gone, by her own choice, with $18 million quietly moved out of their accounts the night before. No note. No goodbye. Just a closet half emptied and a little boy who kept asking when his mother was coming home. Victor didn't have an answer for him that night. He wouldn't have one for years. What he didn't know yet was that the woman who walked out that door would return one day, but not for the reasons he'd spent 5 years hoping for. Before we get deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. I want you to sit with this question for a moment, because I think it matters more than people admit. If someone you loved disappeared without a word, would you spend your life waiting for an explanation? Or would you eventually stop asking why and start rebuilding? Victor chose to keep asking. For a long time, that choice cost him more than he realized. The police investigation didn't take long to close. Security footage showed Vivian walking out of the house on her own, climbing into a taxi with 2 suitcases, no coercion, no struggle, nothing that suggested she'd been forced. It was almost worse that way. A kidnapping would have given Victor someone to blame, something to fight against. Instead, he was left with the quiet, humiliating truth that his wife had simply decided to leave. The missing $18 million surfaced a few days later, wired out in stages so it wouldn't trigger an immediate alert. Victor's lawyers opened a formal case to trace and recover the money, working with the bank's fraud division and investigators. Victor himself barely followed the updates. His thoughts never stayed on bank statements for long. They always drifted back to the little boy waiting by the living room window every evening at 6 o'clock, the exact time Vivian used to come home from her errands, waiting for a car that never pulled into the driveway again. Ivan stopped talking about 3 weeks after his mother left. It wasn't sudden. He simply spoke less and less until one day he stopped altogether. Doctors called it selective mutism brought on by trauma. Victor called every specialist he could find. Nothing worked. The nannies came and went, some lasting a month, some barely a week, worn down by a child who wouldn't make eye contact and a father who was drowning in his own grief while trying to run a company that didn't care about his personal life. Victor's best friend James was the only person who told him the truth without softening it. He said Victor wasn't raising his son anymore, he was surviving alongside him, and that those were 2 very different things. Have you ever watched someone you love go quiet in a way that scared you? Not angry, not sad exactly, just gone somewhere you couldn't follow. That was Ivan for 5 years. A bright kid who used to talk endlessly about dinosaurs, reduced to communicating through drawings left on the kitchen counter. Some days the drawings were dinosaurs. Some days they were a woman standing at a window. Victor kept every single one in a drawer he couldn't bring himself to open often. 5 years passed this way. Bricks Global grew into one of the largest private firms in the country, but the house it paid for grew emptier with every year. Victor buried himself in work because work didn't ask him questions he couldn't answer. Then one ordinary Saturday, a nanny candidate who'd shown up for an unrelated interview took a wrong turn into a bookstore 2 blocks from the office, and everything started to shift in a way nobody expected. Her name was Fiona. She wasn't looking for a job that day. She was killing time before an interview that, frankly, hadn't gone well. She noticed a boy sitting alone in the children's section, not reading, just staring at the same page for 10 straight minutes. She sat a few feet away, folded a piece of scrap paper into a clumsy dinosaur, and set it down near him without a word. He looked at it, then at her. She made a low growling noise, badly, and shrugged like she knew it was ridiculous. Ivan laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real, and it was the first sound like that he'd made in 5 years. Victor, who'd come looking for his son after the nanny agency called to say the appointment had gone wrong, watched the whole thing from the next aisle over, and something in his chest that had been closed for a long time cracked open just slightly. He offered her the nanny position on the spot. She said no. She barely knew this family, and something about the offer felt too sudden, too heavy for a stranger to carry. After 2 more failed interviews with candidates who didn't understand what they were walking into, Victor thought back to the bookstore. After speaking with the agency and checking her references, Victor called again and formally offered her the position. Before she accepted, she asked him one question that told him she understood exactly what was at stake. She asked if she'd be helping his son or replacing someone he still missed every single day. Victor didn't have a clean answer. He told her the truth, that he didn't know, but that Ivan deserved someone who'd try to find out. What would you have done in Fiona's position? Walked away from a wealthy stranger's complicated grief, or stepped into it anyway because a 5-year-old needed someone who wouldn't quit after a hard week? I think that question says more about a person than almost anything else could. The next few months looked like small, unremarkable moments that added up to something enormous. Baking cookies that came out slightly burnt, and eating them anyway. Bedtime stories read in silly voices. Afternoons spent lying in the grass, finding shapes in clouds. Ivan started smiling more. Then one evening, reaching for a crayon, he opened his mouth like he was about to say something, and stopped himself, as if some old fear reminded him it wasn't safe yet. Fiona never pushed. She just kept showing up, day after day, proving with her presence rather than her words that she wasn't going anywhere. Victor changed too, in ways he didn't fully notice until James pointed them out. He started leaving the office earlier. He laughed at things that weren't even that funny. He caught himself watching Fiona with Ivan from the hallway, staying a little too long before walking away. James finally said what Victor had been avoiding, that he wasn't afraid of falling for her. He was afraid of what it would mean if she eventually left too. Victor didn't deny it. He'd already lost one person who was supposed to stay. He wasn't sure he could survive losing another. None of them knew they were being watched. Vivian had come back into the city months earlier, quietly, without announcing herself to anyone. She rented a small apartment under her maiden name and avoided anyone connected to Victor's world. She'd stood across the street more than once, watching a life continue without her in it, watching a stranger make her son laugh in a way she hadn't managed to in years, even before she left. It's worth asking yourself here what jealousy does to a person who already feels like they've lost everything. It rarely makes them kind. For Vivian, watching that family heal without her didn't inspire regret so much as resentment, and resentment has a way of curdling into something far more dangerous. When Vivian finally walked back into Bricks Global, the room went quiet. People who'd worked there for years didn't know what to say to a woman most of them assumed they'd never see again. She told Victor she wanted another chance, that she'd made a terrible mistake and regretted every year she'd missed. For a moment, just a moment, Victor almost believed her. Then she asked about the money. Not about Ivan. Not about the years she'd missed. The money. That single detail told him everything he needed to know about why she'd really come back. James, never one to take things at face value, quietly hired investigators to look into where Vivian had actually been. What they found wasn't a woman who'd spent 5 years finding herself. It was a woman who'd burned through $18 million on debts, bad investments, and people who weren't the sort you wanted showing up at your door asking for repayment. She hadn't come back out of love. She'd come back because she had nowhere else left to go, and a wealthy ex-husband with a soft spot for his son looked like her last option. Here's a question worth sitting with. Have you ever watched someone realize they've lost something not because of bad luck, but because of choices they made themselves? Vivian wasn't a monster from the beginning. She was a woman who wanted more than the life she had, and made a decision that cost her everything that actually mattered. By the time she understood that, it was already too late to undo it, and instead of accepting that, she let the loss turn into something uglier. She saw Ivan calling Fiona, Fiona, with more warmth than he'd ever spoken to her, even before she left. She saw Victor trust a stranger with the 2 things he loved most. And she decided that if she couldn't have her family back, she'd rather no one have it. That thought, quiet and cold, is the moment this story stops being about heartbreak and starts becoming something far more frightening. The night after she left Victor's office, Vivian sat alone in a cheap rented room, still wearing the coat she'd worn to look presentable that morning. She caught her reflection in a cracked mirror above the sink and didn't recognize the woman looking back. She cried in a way she hadn't allowed herself to in years, not composed, not quiet, but the kind of crying that comes from someone who finally sees the full shape of what they've lost. She thought about calling Victor, about telling him the truth instead of another version of it. She picked up her phone twice and put it down both times. By morning, the grief hadn't gone anywhere, but it had hardened into something else, something she found easier to act on than sorrow. She stopped asking herself how to fix what she'd broken and started asking herself what she still had the power to take. Over the next several days, she tried calling Victor repeatedly. He never answered. She wrote messages she never sent. She watched from across the street as Fiona became part of the life she'd thrown away. By the end of the week, desperation had replaced reason. To everyone who had seen her leave Victor's office, Vivian appeared to be accepting defeat. It was a performance. Within days, she'd arranged for two men to grab Ivan on his way home from school, men who didn't know or care whose child they were taking, only that they were being paid. Ivan, terrified but sharper than anyone gave him credit for, managed to drop small folded paper cranes along the route, something Fiona had taught him weeks earlier during one of their quiet afternoons together. It was a small detail from an ordinary day that ended up mattering more than anyone could have guessed. Fiona noticed the first crane within an hour of Ivan not coming home. She noticed the second one 3 blocks later. She called Victor immediately, and Victor called the police while James worked to figure out where Vivian might have gone. James traced Vivian's location to a warehouse on the edge of the city, and police were dispatched to the address immediately. Fiona and Victor were already closer, following the trail of cranes on their own, which is why Fiona reached the building first, minutes ahead of the patrol units still en route. Rather than waiting outside, she slipped in through a side door she found unlocked, trying to get eyes on Ivan before anything could go wrong in the minutes before backup arrived. I want you to think about what it takes to move toward a situation like that, even with police only minutes out, simply because someone you love might be in danger. That's not the kind of courage you plan for. It's the kind that shows up when it has to. Inside, she found Ivan tied to a chair, frightened but unhurt, and one of the two men who'd taken him standing nearby while the other argued on the phone in the next room. Fiona had trained in Taekwondo years earlier and used what she remembered to get Ivan loose and put herself between him and the man closest to them, taking a shove to the shoulder that would leave a bruise for a week. She didn't overpower anyone. She bought time, shielding Ivan and keeping the man's attention on her instead of on the door. That was enough. Sirens were already close, and within a minute the police were moving through the building, subduing both men before the situation could escalate further. Vivian was arrested outside, still waiting for a phone call that would never come. At the hospital, paramedics treated a cut along Fiona's arm while Ivan sat beside her, refusing to leave. For a long moment, nobody said anything. Then Ivan did something none of them had heard in 5 years. He said a word. Everyone in that room turned toward Vivian's absence, half expecting, half hoping, that the word he'd finally speak would be for her. Instead, he looked at Fiona, reached for her hand, and asked her not to leave. Victor, standing in the doorway, felt something break open in his chest that had been sealed shut since the night his wife disappeared. Fiona promised him she wasn't going anywhere, and for the first time in 5 years, that was a promise someone in that family actually believed. If you were Victor, sitting in that hospital hallway after everything that had happened, what would you have felt in that moment? Relief. Grief for the years already lost. Something like hope, finally allowed back in after being kept at a distance for so long. I think most of us would feel all three at once, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Several months later, in a small backyard ceremony with people who actually mattered instead of a crowd for appearances, Victor and Fiona got married. When the officiant asked who was giving the bride away, a 10-year-old boy in a small suit raised his hand without being prompted and said, quietly but clearly, that he would. It wasn't a scripted moment. Nobody had rehearsed it with him. It was simply true, and everyone standing there understood exactly what it meant. Looking back now, Victor says he spent years searching for an explanation from the person who left, when the person who was actually going to stay hadn't even entered their lives yet. He doesn't say that to excuse what Vivian did. He says it because it's the part of the story that ended up mattering most. So here's what I'll leave you with. Family isn't always the people who share your blood or your last name. Sometimes it's the person who shows up on an ordinary day, folds a paper dinosaur, and decides to stay through everything that follows. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments who you were rooting for and whether you think Victor made the right choice in the end. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed because the next one might hit even closer to home.